Welcome to Ordo Militaris Radio TV. And today's topic is going to be on Richard the Lionheart, his life, clearing up any myths, lies portrayed by Hollywood, modern history, the Masonic history. But first, since it is the feast of my great uncle, St. King Louis IX, the head of the House of Bourbon put out a nice letter. So we'll start with that, and thanks to brother Alexis Bonello for doing the English translation really quick.
Okay, and I'll point out that he styles himself the Duke of Anjou, Louis XX, an heir to the throne of France. But let's just point out that he is a descendant of Philippe, the son, one of the French kings, who had renounced his claim to the throne of France, and he's the son of another Bourbon who had renounced his claim to the throne of Spain. So he has no claim to the throne of France or Spain, and he styles himself the Duke of Anjou, but he doesn't have a claim on that either. But he is a member of the House of Bourbon, and he is in the male line of descent, a descendant of the Capetian kings. So.
Yep. So let's read the letter. With the responsibility imposed on me by the 8 centuries of Capetian royalty, which I am that heir, the current seriousness of the state of France leads me to express myself on this day when the church celebrates St. Louis, the model rulers. I have to admit that our country is sinking into more and more serious days. While I would like my statements to salute the renewal, that all faithful French people who believe in the destiny of their country, which they hope for with all their heart, affected for several years by a moral crisis which makes her doubt herself, her mission, her identity. France is forced also to undergo numerous attacks from the outside, so diffuse and perverse that it is difficult to always identify them well. It is difficult to find the right responses. Difficulty is all the greater as the truth is no longer looked at in the face, and words are disguised by ideology to the point of losing their meaning. Those who resist valiantly without losing confidence, often animated by deep faith, are not enough to redress the situation. Likewise, our soldiers engaged in many areas beyond our borders. Note that their sacrifice and abnegation are not enough in isolation to create a winning dynamic. The battles are certainly won on the ground, but it is first of all in the hearts and minds that conditions for victory are forged, which must find its political expression. It will only take a few things to give her back this taste and a sense of victory that France had, sure of herself and her mission, and remind her of the great moments of her past which remain examples for tomorrow. This state of mind, which could arise again if the French wanted it, seems forgotten, annihilated. The elites since the revolution have acted only out of self-interest. When will we return to the common good, to justice, to the protection of the weakest? When will we agree to give words back their meaning and forget that there is no incivility, no young savages, but gratuitous violence in you barbarians without faith or law? That we must fight and punish, indeed, each of their crimes ruins social life. Social life is already very difficult for many French people who are already faced with an often critical economic and social situation. The last health crisis has shown how much our compatriots are capable of bursts and initiatives when the state does not oppress them, when it does not overwhelm them with an increasingly heavy and unfair taxation, since it no longer provides public services. The French, in increasing number, realize that the institutions no longer meet their legitimate expectations. How many more crises will it take? How many sacrificed for the eyes to open? Lucid minds have asked the question whether these events, with the accumulated errors that result in hundreds of thousands of deaths all over the world, were not the occasion to reflect on the disorders of the last decades. The beautiful symbol of the day after seemed to hold a future. In reality, a few months later, bad habits have largely triumphed over good resolutions. And the days after seem even more catastrophic than those before. The vote in front of an almost deserted assembly of the so-called bioethics laws approving abortion up to the ninth month is the most striking manifestation of this. It is at the same time contrary to the natural order and to ethics. This law combines the denial of the current representative system by the way in which it developed and the break with foundations of humanity. Manipulations against nature are taking a new step towards a society of the chimera, where no limit seems to hold back men. The society of fear and constraints is now also that of planned death. What world awaits us? What world will we leave to our children? I'm speaking here as heir and successor to the King of France, but also as a father and husband. I know how many young couples are worried about the future of society, the future of the children, of our children. Fortunately, centuries of history teach us that the most terrible situations are not irreversible. France has escaped other dangers, and thus even when it almost lost its sovereignty, as in the time of Charles VII. Joan of Arc's mission saved him from a peril all the more imminent as the enemy was already installed on our soil. The one who in 1920 became the patron saint of patriotism, saved the country and restored the legitimate monarchy. May St. Louis, model of sovereigns and rulers, protect France and help him find the meaning of his mission. Louis of Bourbon.
It's a very admirable letter, I'd have to say, and even
Few
though it
errors.
is mild, it's a mild way of saying things. Yeah. What are some errors you see right from the beginning, AJ?
He calls the French Masonic army our army. They aren't our army. They are occupation force. And he is not the heir to the King of France. His family denounced it.
Yeah. So, uh, one of the things that if we're going to talk about claims to the thrones of kingdoms, we have to be strict in the law. And if you're descended from someone who actually renounced it, then you can't reinvent a claim to it. Even though by blood he would otherwise be, you would say he's a natural heir, but he's not a legal heir. But there are many descendants of prior kings of France who never renounced the title. But it was a rather good, admirable letter, and he made a point to mention things that need to be said.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully the House of Orleans makes similar statements, although the House of Orleans descends from the Duke of Orleans, who actually voted for the execution of Louis XVI. So I don't really think they have any claim either, because that's a crime of treason, and you are tainted in law for that. It means you lose all titles and claims thereafter for yourself and your descendants. So the House of Bourbon is in a pretty bad state. I haven't looked at whether the House of Bourbon in Naples has a claim to the throne of France. That'd be interesting through Charles of Anjou.
Yeah.
But the other thing is he calls himself the Duke of Anjou. What do you have to say to that, AJ?
He has to go through the Plantagenet line.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the Count of Anjou, or actually the Plantagenet heir to the county of Anjou and to the throne of England.
Mm-hmm.
A great man. He's not a saint, okay, but he really merits his epitaph, which is the Lionheart. King Richard I Plantagenet. So let's learn more about him, because I think most people know very little. Maybe they've seen a Hollywood film about the Crusades, or they've read something on Wikipedia. And he's a great man who's done many great things, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding about him. So let's go right to the issue now. King Richard I and Lionheart. Who were his parents, and what century did he live?
The would have been starts off about about he was about year of he died in the year 1199, so the 1100s.
Okay, 12th century. And then were his parents?
Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II. His family, his father, King Henry II, was a Frenchman from Anjou. It was necessary to go. I'm quoting from the official biography by John Gillingham from the L's English Monarchs book. It quotes, since his father, King Henry II, was a Frenchman from Anjou, it was necessary to go a long way back in Richard's family tree to find an English ancestor. To one of his great-grandmothers, Edith, the wife of King Henry I. This English link, slight as it is, was none the less well known to the men who frequented the princely courts of Europe. For in their world, family connection was all important. It shaped the destinies not just of individuals, but of the entire provinces and kingdoms. On the contemporary student of these matters, the learned historian Ralph of Deceto, Dean of St. Paul's, traced Richard's ancestry through Edith to the Anglo-Saxon kings of Wessex, the line of Alfred the Great and Cedric, then through them back to Odin and Noah.
Now, just to point out here from the beginning, Richard was the brother of John, the famous King John, who features in the Robin Hood tales.
Yeah.
And you are actually a physical heir of King John, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're talking about a great uncle in the family. So tell us something about what Richard was like as a young man, and how did he get the name Lionheart?
Yeah. Let me go to the Wikipedia, actually sorts the source. I was impressed. Use Richard was born 8th of September 1157 at the Beaumont Palace in Oxford, England. He was the younger brother of Henry the Young King, Matilda, Duchess of Saxony. As the younger son of King Henry II, he was not expected to ascend to the throne. He was also the elder brother of Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany, Queen Eleanor of Castile, Queen Joan of Sicily, and Count John of Mortain, who succeeded him as King Richard, was younger maternal half-brother of Marie of France, Countess of Champagne, and Alix, Countess of Blois. So let's see here. Okay. You got the name Richard the Lionheart by he was brave in all of his battles. and sorry for the delay, folks. Just looking for it because it tells about it. Okay.
While you're looking for that, I just want to mention, if you want to get a visual conception of what Richard the Lionheart and his family were like, there's an excellent movie with Ingrid Bergman called The Lion Who Roared in Winter, and it's a dramatic dialogue in family members. That's not very historically accurate in some things. It gives you a sense of what it was like for Richard to live in the royal family and what was going
Yeah.
on, although it's written in a very negative light by a Jewish author who wanted to defame the family. But it gives you an idea at least how they dressed and how they lived.
Yeah. Okay. Richard is known as Richard Coeur de Lion, Norman French, Le Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, because of his reputation as a great military leader and warrior,
Mm-hmm.
which you'll learn in his battles.
Okay, so now there are some myths and lies that surround the modern understanding of Richard the Lionheart. Can we just briefly cover those so that we get those out of the way and talk about the real Richard?
Yeah, I'm getting to it. Okay, to his okay. Here we go. Right after his crowning as king. Now, people call him anti-Semite, they call him anti-Jewish, and all that nonsense, but here's what his official policy was right after his crowning, and when he learned of news of some people killed Jews, and they thought it was him, thought it was done by his orders. But while the feasting went on inside the palace, a riot developed outside. Some Jews bringing gifts for the new king had tried to enter, but the Christian crowd at the gates would not have this. They fell upon the Jews, killing some and wounding others. The trouble then spread to the city of London, where it continued throughout the night. Jews were killed and their houses plundered and burned down. Next day, Richard had some of the rioters arrested. Three of them hanged, and a Jew who, in fear of his life, had agreed to be baptized as a Christian. He encouraged to return to his religion. He then sent letters to every shire ordering that Jews should not be should, he sent letters to every shire ordering that the Jews should be left in peace. According to the early 13th century Anonymous of Leon, he sent envoys to Normandy and Poitiers to prevent anything similar happening there. The Jews were under his special protection, whether or not his dealings suggest he was unusually tolerant. Like many kings of the time, he regarded them as a valuable source of revenue.
Mm-hmm. Let's point out that it was against the law for Jews to present gifts to an English king during his coronation ceremony. And the reason for that was to prevent bribery. And because the king was supposed to be the advocate of Christians in his realm. And the Jews were notorious for charging outrageous interest rates, sometimes as much as 50% a month. And so the people had very low opinion of them, okay? Not because they were Jewish, but because they were avaricious. And that's not true of all Jews, but that's how the reputation in the medieval society, if someone of a certain group committed a crime, it was usually understood that everyone was somehow associated because people didn't think with proper distinctions.
Yeah.
So, but he went to great lengths to protect Jews being persecuted, and that's quite unusual because he could have just let it go on, especially in the medieval times. It would be almost impossible for the king to know how the riot began, who was responsible. They didn't have police. They didn't have forensic investigations. They didn't have cameras, and most witnesses couldn't read or write. So yeah, that's extraordinary what he did. So, but there's some other lies to put out. I mean, I think it is said by many that he was a homosexual,
Mm-hmm.
and which is a really vile lie. What did you learn in your studies about that charge and why it's not true?
Well, it was so untrue, it was never brought up in the book.
It's a complete modern myth, you mean?
Yeah.
Mhm. And he did marry and have heirs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's no evidence for that lie. So one thing that I've noticed is Hollywood, which is controlled by Jews, or at least has been for many of its decades, often will make a film about a historic Catholic monarch and vilely attack them. We've seen attacks about Queen Isabella, King Richard, Philip of France,
Mm-hmm.
because at some point in their history, they didn't treat Jews the way Jews want to be treated today, and so they're inspired by absolute vicious prejudice and inability to forget something that happened centuries ago. They want to dig it all up and paint Catholics bad, and you always have to be sensitive to that when you're watching a movie from the Hollywood. So his eldest brother dies before he can, I think, can inherit the throne, Henry I, and he ends up king. Can you tell us more about his coronation and how unexpected it was?
Yeah. That's it. Ever since his father's death, Richard had been engaged in a sustained exercise in image manipulation. Undeniably, he had sinned in taking up arms against his father. For this sin, he needed absolution. He obtained it from the archbishops of Canterbury and Rouen as soon as he entered Normandy at Sees. More doubtful was the question of honor. Had he acted dishonorably, had not William Marshal told Henry of Richard's faults and bitter treachery in 1188? Yet he had publicly proclaimed his opposition to his father at Bondsmoulins in his father's presence, and at the time when Henry was still at the height of power. In this was he to be compared with those who pretended to be loyal, but who betrayed precisely at the moment when their support was most needed? Treachery was a question of timing. Thus he made an example of Guy de Val, Ralph of Forges, and Jules III de Many, three prominent barons who had belatedly joined the war against his father. He seized their estates and announced that this was an appropriate reward for all who abandoned their lord in his time of need. Platitudes of this sort were intended to give the message that the new king was a man with a keen sense of honor. In Rogers of Howden's words, he honorably retained all those servants of the king, his father, whom he knew to be loyal, and who had loyally served his father, restored them to the posts which they had long held from his father, to each they deserved, but he despised those clerks and laymen who had deserted his father and gone over to him, and these he dismissed from his service. What mattered most to Richard was honor, or at any rate his reputation for honor, especially at the most critical moments, such as the decision to take up arms against his father, or later the decision to make peace with Saladin. And one of betraying de Bon's songs, Nostre Signori Somenes el Meses, almost certainly composed in 1188, we are told that Richard desired honors more than any man, Christian or infidel. He seeks honors and success so intently that his reputation constantly grows and improves. In a single stanza about Richard, Bertrand uses the words pretes no fewer than 7 times in only 9 lines. In 1189, Richard wanted to draw a sharp distinction between his disobedience and others' treachery. Then
Okay, I'll point out just one thing about Gillen's commentary here is a man who seeks honor is not necessarily dishonest. Okay, and Gillen is trying to make it appear that Richard was just totally an opportunist. But to promote back to office those who are loyal to your father and demote those who joined you in your own rebellion against the father, and it wasn't really that much, it was a war against his father, but is a really sacrificial act of honesty, okay? It's not just someone seeking the fame of honor. That is true honor, okay?
Mhm.
And the other thing is we have to understand that it is wrong for a subject to rebel against his king, but it is, in a certain sense, less offensive for a son to have an argument with his king, even if it results with force of arms, because as a son, he is, in a certain sense, the equal of his father, and therefore has a certain right to have a disagreement with his father that no subject has. So he punished rightly those who joined him in the rebellion against his father, and he restored rightly back to office those who remained loyal to his father once he himself became king. Because as king, then he must take the position of the king and not of his previous private self. So here's a man who understands the distinction between private affairs and public affairs and what true honor is. And Gillen makes it appear that he wasn't truly honorable, and that's just a messed up notion of virtue. So he did his penance and he undid the evil he did. And that takes a great character and a true sense of honor.
Yeah, and it continue, and then it comes to his crowning. First, there's a song that they sang for him when he came back to England. After this eventide, and by virtue of a more joyful event, a new day's star, ascending will bring a time of prosperity by a sudden change at sunrise. In the hope of healing grace, rejoice. You're about to receive the flower of chivalry, whose word has a truth that comes from the heart, whose tireless munificence cannot be exhausted, but when he who has given much thinks he has given little. The courteous count declares himself to be fit for you. Love with dread will ally his men to you. Richard of Poitou, the future king of England. Amur cum timur, Ricardos pecativi, rex futurus angri.
So political publicity back then really had its elegance to it. And we have to remember that's because he was the Catholic king of England. And so his title as king was not political; it was hereditary and religious too.
Mm.
So it's not based on the fakery of modern politics, which is completely puff pieces for people with no character at all, more or less.
Here's
So
the,
yeah.
and if you want me to continue, it talks about his actual ceremony.
Yeah, what was the coronation of a king of England like? Tell us.
Okay. When Richard landed at Portsmouth on 13th August 1189, he was greeted with enthusiasm. People found it all too easy to believe that a new king meant a fresh start and an easier life. Looking back after Richard's death, the stern Cistercian moralist Ralph of Coggeshall was to say that at the beginning of his reign, Richard appeared to be the mirror of kings. Not bad for a son who had just hounded his father to death. The image-building campaign had worked. On Sunday, 13th September, he was crowned in Westminster Abbey. In Roger of Howden's description of the ceremony, we have the first detailed account of a coronation in English history. At the heart of the service lay not this crowning of the new ruler, but his anointing. All his clothes were stripped off except his breeches and his shirt, which was open to show his chest. Baldwin, the Archbishop of Canterbury, then anointed him with holy oil on his head, the chest, and hands. This act was believed to confer upon the new ruler divine sanction for his kingship. After the anointing, Richard was dressed in the ceremonial robes and then crowned. In later coronation services, it was the archbishop who took the crown from the altar in order to place it on the king's head. But in 1189, Richard himself picked up the crown and handed it to the archbishop. Whether or not this was an innovation, it was a characteristic gesture of self-help. He then mounted the throne and sat there while Mass was celebrated. After the service came the coronation banquet. The clergy in due order of rank dined at his table, while the laity, earls, barons, and knights had separate tables. They all feasted splendidly. Some idea of the scale of the occasion may be gathered from the fact that at least 1,770 pitchers, 900 cups, 5,050 dishes had been brought in preparation for it. It was just a kind of pageantry in which Richard delighted. The words of a song believed to have been sung for the coronation of this most musical king reiterate the theme of dawning of the new age. The age of gold returned. The world reform draws nigh. The rich man now cast down, the pauper raised on high.
Beautiful ceremony. One thing people don't understand that when Catholics feasted in the Middle Ages, they feasted. They ate like, a week's worth of food in one day. And that's because so frequently, the most people in the Middle Ages, 80% of everything they ate was just bread, okay? And then beans and vegetables, and only about like 5% was meat. So to have a feast with all kinds of meats cooked was an unusual affair. And it would be one of those things that you'd see once in your lifetime and people would remember. And it was perhaps for that reason that it was chronicled. And shows you the true faith, helps you understand what a true feast is about. So he becomes king, and then pretty quickly thereafter, he ends up on the Third Crusade. Now, how did that happen?
Yeah. Okay. So he's already made plans to go on the crusade, but he already taken the cross as Count of Poitou in 1187. His father and Philip II had done so at Gisors on 21st January 1188. Receiving the news of the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin. After Richard became king, he and Philip agreed to go on the Third Crusade, since each feared that during his absence other might usurp his territories. So he swore an oath. He did penance again, confessed all of his past wickedness once again, and took up the cross, and spent most of the Henry II's treasury and filled with money raised by the Saladin tithe, and then they began to move on to Sicily.
Yeah, so I think he sails he marches, he sails across the channel and marches down through France to, I think, Toulouse, where he boards ships for Messina, and there he spends his winter. What is all this Hollywood nonsense about what happens in Messina. Can you set the record straight? What really happened there?
Well, if y'all watched the movie The Kingdom of Heaven because you wanted to watch a movie on the Crusades, and like surely they didn't forge all of it. You see the last scene of the movie where a king rides up to the blacksmith shop and he's asking for Balian of Ibelin, the defender of Jerusalem. Now, it says he was okay. He was now. It was a real guy, but he was also known as Barrison the Younger. He was a Crusader noble of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century. He was Lord of Libnan from 1170 to 1193, and he did defend the city of Jerusalem and surrendered to Saladin. But uh, I do not believe he actually met Richard, so that part in the movie was false.
Yeah, so what year did actually Richard set out on the Third Crusade? We're talking about 92, 1192, 1193, 1194, what year?
September 1190.
Okay, September 1190. And he gets to Messina, he's still in Messina in the winter of 1991?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a old film, I think from the 50s about the Third Crusade, and it shows him march all his way down to Toulouse. And at Toulouse, he's men don't have meat, so he makes a deal with the Count of Toulouse to get all this cattle, and he has to marry this his daughter and stuff. That's just completely inaccurate. Okay, so he actually was at Messina where he made an agreement to marry a local princess to get supplies, and but ends up not going through with that marriage arrangement and marrying Berengara, the daughter of the King of Navarre. And it wasn't because he would send cattle. Navarre was too far away to send cattle, and Navarre is landlocked. So that is a bit incorrect. But while they are at Messina, there was a shortage of food, and they had to actually have to get in some conflict with my ancient relatives on my mother's side, because my family's from Messina, and over supplies. So when does he marry Queen Berengaria, and what's her relationship to you, AJ?
She is my 40th great aunt.
Okay, so he married her what, in the winter of 91, was it?
Before leaving Cyprus on crusade, Richard married Berengara, the firstborn daughter of King Sancho the Sixth of Navarre. Richard first grew close to her at a tournament held in her native Navarre. The wedding was held in Limassol. It's a city on the southern coast of Cyprus, and on the 12th of May, 1191.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for people who don't know, Navarre is an ancient kingdom that existed in Spain, and it's basically, if you go the coast of France, it goes to the coast of Spain, you have that kind of like right angle. At that corner there, a bit inland, it was the Kingdom of Navarre. I wanted to point out some interesting things about the dates you're telling us. King Richard was born on the birthday of Our Lady, September 8th, and he was crowned king on the 13th of September, which is the vigil of the Holy Cross. And and he was married in May, a month which was very common for marriages in the Middle Ages because it was the month of flowers. And so after getting supplies at Messina, his fleet sails onward to the Holy Land. And but how did he get his ships to get to the Holy Land? This kind of shows that he was a good negotiator. What is this about Excalibur and ships and Tancred? This is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, he needed ships. So he has a sword. It's his sword called Excalibur. He says it's from King Arthur himself. And so he goes to Tancred, like saying, I need some ships. And so he's like, okay, give me the sword. And so he gets he gets okay, come on, bud. He gets at least 12 of the bit. Okay, this is silly. I can't find anything. I hate this book. This book is the worst thing ever.
I think you remember. I remember you telling me the other day you got like 12 or 15 large cargo ships and maybe 30 or 35 smaller vessels.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely amazing. You're talking about in exchange for one sword, he got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of naval craft. And this shows you something about the Catholic mind in the Middle Ages is very different from the modern mind. In modern times, they say, well, you know, that sword it might be an artifact, okay, but it's only has so much metal in it. It's really, you know, it's worth 5 million, something like that. But in the Middle Ages, they valued things on their historical importance, as especially if they were like relics of ancient times and associated with famous people. And so the price he got for that sword is just something it would not exist in any other time, um, and that he bought a whole navy for a sword. And I wonder whatever happened to that sword. But the tankard he bought it from was king of Two Sicilies. So maybe it ended up in the treasury of the house of the king of Two Sicilies. And maybe the Bourbons still have it. I don't know, the Bourbons of Sicily. So he gets his navy, and that enables him to sail to the Holy Land. But
Mm-hmm.
on his way, a storm kicks up, and he gets shipwrecked on Cyprus. Now, Cyprus is that island in the eastern Mediterranean that's kind of like in the corner there between Syria and Turkey. So what happens once he gets shipwrecked on Cyprus?
Yeah. Well, he writes in an actual newsletter to his people, to his guys on sent to Longchamp. Written on 6 August, he summarized what happened after he left Messina. As we were continuing our pilgrimage journey, we turned to Cyprus, where we hoped to find the refuge of those of our number who had been shipwrecked. But the tyrant who, revering neither God nor man, had usurped the name of emperor, hurriedly brought a strongly armed force to bar us from the port. He robbed and despoiled as many as possible of our men who had suffered wreck and imprisoned those dying of hunger. Not unnaturally, we were spurred to revenge. We did battle with our enemy, and thanks to divine assistance, obtained a quick victory, defeated and fettered we'd hold him together with his only daughter. We have subjected to ourselves the whole island of Cyprus with all its strong points.
Now, this is an amazing thing. So out of justice to liberate the shipwrecked, he ends up in this conflict. I want to point out one thing that's different in the Catholic world from the Masonic world. In the Masonic world, they say, okay, well, now that you freed your prisoners, you have to give Cyprus back to the tyrant. No, that's not how a Catholic world wins. The Catholic world is you committed a horrible crime, you lose your right to rule, and since we defeated you, now it's ours. In fact, the Kingdom of Cyprus passes through to the hands of King Richard. I think he ends up selling it to the house of Angoulême, or French house, who ends up holding it until the 15th century when the Ottomans take it. So in the Catholic world, if you capture it, you keep it. And that's the natural law, and that's common sense. And you notice no Masonic nation does that because they're actually serving one another. And they don't actually want Christians to get control of non-Christian land, so they always give it back. So all that happens while his Crusaders are already in the process of sieging Acre, and then he arrives on the scene too. Now, Acre, just to let everyone know, the full name of the town was Saint John of Acre. It was a fortified port, I think near modern Haifa, Israel, and it was one of the chief entrepôts or supply bases for the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was the key point to control. And after Saladin captured Jerusalem, he also conquered most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So Acre was like a little bridgehead or enclave of Christian control on the coast, surrounded by enemy territory on all sides. And the Knights of Malta and the Knight Hospitallers had built lots of little fortresses all around it to defend it. It was hardly defended. So this is how the Third Crusade opens. It opens with the siege of Acre. And I think Acre was being sieged by Saladin, or was the Muslims already in the city and the Christians were sieging it to take it back?
They were already in the city, and the Christians are sieging it to get it back. And they had to work quick because the occasional Muslim supply ship was getting close to the port. So this is what goes on. To protect their position from attack both from the garrison and from Saladin's field force, the Christians dug a double line of trenches across the peninsula on which Acre stood. From now on, Acre was subjected to a close landward blockade. From behind their trenches, the Crusaders' artillery bombarded the city walls, while the garrison replied in kind. Occasionally, a major assault was launched when mobile siege towers or battering rams were employed, and the siege artillery brought up much closer to the walls. But at these times, the besiegers' engines were vulnerable to the incendiary weapons, Greek fire of the defenders. This position of stalemate was reached. General Saladin remained in his camp in the hills at Shafaran, about 7 miles away from the Christians, moving up to Telahadi, 2.5 miles away, when the garrison needed closer support. Both sides settled down to a struggle of attrition, the combination of artillery duel and trench warfare. That Saladin should remain nearby throughout the entirety of this siege, and the extraordinary testament to his appreciation of its vital importance. In the spring of 1190, and again in 1191, when the sea became navigable again, both sides were able to bring in further reinforcements and supplies. 2 Egyptian fleets fought their way in, but the galleys with which Saladin had hoped to contest Christian dominance of their eastern Mediterranean became immobilized there, because the crews were needed to man the walls in the increasingly desperate struggle. Even Ambrose learned to admire the Muslim defenders of Acre for holding out when they beheld how a whole world was coming to destroy them. As months turned into years, and men, and on Frankish side, women fought and died as the tales of suffering and heroism grew. So the stakes and the tensions grew higher and higher. And on June 5th, Richard set sail from, from Augusta. He made his first landfall near the great castle of the Knights of St. John at Margate. This castle was to be Isaac's prison. Then he sailed south, reaching Tyre the next day. The garrison of Tyre, however, acting on instruction from King Philip and Conrad of Montferrat, refused him permission to enter the town. So Richard spent the night encamped outside the walls, and on 7th June continued on his voyage to Acre. According to Sicard of Cremonia, he was in command of 24 galleys guarding the rear of his convoy when they fell in with a huge three-masted ship coming from Beirut, laden with supplies and reinforcements for the garrison of Acre. Howden claimed that it was carrying as many as 1,500 elite warriors, doubtless an exaggeration, but one which reflects a perception of the ship's awesome size. Philip's recognition of Conrad as king meant that as much time had to be spent on politics as on war. According to Howden, both Pisans and Genesee offered Richard their service, but he would not accept that of the Genoese, since they had already pledged their allegiance to Philip and Conrad. Confidence of Richard's support, Geoffrey de Lusignan, on his brother's behalf, accused Conrad of treason. But again, according to Howden, no one dared lay a hand on him for fear of a tumult in the city. Conrad subsequently fled to Tyre, leaving Bahad al-Din that if he remained at Acre, he would be arrested in Tyre and given to Guy. Even at the height of the struggle against Saladin, the two kings were contending against each other. Philip had offered pay of 3 bezants, or 3 gold pieces, to any knights who would join his service, only to be outbid by Richard, who offered 4. The rivalry of the kings was reflected in the histories within their realms. And when Richard arrived, Saladin's men gloomily noted with 25 ships, each one as big as a citadel. But these 25 compared just a part of Richard's fleet. Most of his transports carrying many barons in their following, together with much of the siege equipment, are still at Tyre, delayed by the azure wind, and did not arrive until several weeks later. So when he showed up, Saladin's forces um, became very just depressed. And we have lost Brother Alexis Bono for a moment. Hopefully he will be back. Okay, he's setting up his audio, folks. Okay.
Okay, I hope we didn't have to interrupt the recording, AJ.
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. I can't believe it, but a telehacker called me and it caused the line to collapse. So I had to switch to a different Wi-Fi source and renew the conversation. I hope you got your description of the Battle of Acre in, though.
Yeah. We're about ready for about what type of sickness they suffered.
Yeah. So one thing this scene of the Battle of Acres depicted in the movie from the 50s on the Third Crusade. And the chief problem at the battle was the dissension among Christian forces, because whereas Richard was the much better commander, and I'll pause a moment here. I see the connection's unstable, and So that was the chief issue. The other thing is that the Christians, the Catholics, had much better navies because they were designed for heavier seas, and so from that point of view, they had um, naval superiority. The other thing interesting thing is that we think trench warfare is modern warfare, and we see that they were digging trenches there in this battle. One thing I would point out in there, I think Gillen is wrong in what he's saying, and I can't say I'm 100% expert on it, but I'm pretty sure he talked about bombardment, okay, and he used the word artillery. It gives the impression that using gunpowder and actual artillery the way we use the term today. I don't believe they had guns of that kind in the Third Crusade, not for another 2 centuries. I think it was only at the 15th century does actual gunpowder artillery come into use. So he's referring to things like mangonellans, catapults, ballista that would hurl by a counterweight huge rocks or throw huge dart-like projectiles at the enemy, or smaller stones and things of that kind, not actual artillery that would be fired with black powder and stuff. So I kind of surprised that he used those terms in that description of the battle. But okay, so now let's get to disease. Now, disease was a big thing in the 12th, 13th centuries. They didn't know disease theory. They didn't know about pollution. They didn't know about sanitation. Some of the greatest people of the Middle Ages died due to bad sanitation. St. Bonaventure and a good number of the fathers of the Second Council of Lyon, France died. And it seems there's always bad sanitation breaking out when you have French troops present. Louis IX on the 8th Crusade dies of dysentery because of bad sanitation. And here we have the French army present. And what do you know?
Yeah.
They get sick.
However, Richard fell gravely ill, and this, in Imad al-Din's opinion, allowed the defenders of Acre a breathing space, a chance to rest and make some repairs. Philip also fell ill. The chroniclers called their illness on Aladia or Leonardia, a fever which caused their hair and nails to fall out. It was probably a form of scurvy or trench mouth. At one point, Richard's life was thought to be in danger, but as soon as his condition began to improve, he insisted that he be carried to the front line in a litter so that he could continue to direct siege operations, display his skills with a crossbow.
Mm-hmm. I'm surprised that they would suffer from scurvy because their fleets came from Messina, and Messina they would have picked up a large quantity of salted citrus fruit, which preserves for many, many months. I'm very surprised, but the English, no one understood what scurvy was back then, which is a lack of vitamin C. And if you go 90 days without any vitamin C, your teeth, nails, and hair start falling out because it's an necessary nutrient. But you can get vitamin C from the most common vegetables like pickles and almost any fresh vegetable, especially fresh fruits. And though that might have been scarce by at least by May or so, you're going to have fruits coming out. But if they didn't control any of the land, that might have been hard to get it. But you can get vitamin C from eating fresh seafood, although once it's cooked, it loses some of that. Yeah. And you can certainly get it from wine.
And Richard's illness had also interrupted his diplomacy. On 18 June, he had sent an envoy to Saladin, suggesting that the two of them should meet. Saladin's response was that he would do this only after the preliminary agreement that had been reached. The envoy tried again, suggesting that they should meet alone except for the interpreter. Again, this was turned down, but it was agreed that he and Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, should meet. Saladin's entourage then heard nothing for a while. They suspected that the other Frankish princes had opposed the scheme. However, the envoy reappeared with a message from Richard. Do not believe the reports which have been spread. Only my illness has caused delay. I am answerable only to myself for what I do. No one has any authority over me. An exchange of gifts was then proposed by Richard. On the 1st July, his envoy returned, bringing a Muslim prisoner whom he gave to Saladin. As Bah al-Din knew well, the object of these frequent visits was to ascertain the state of our morale, and were induced to receive the enemy's messages by the same motive that prompted them. On 4th July, 3 envoys were allowed to visit the Muslim market. Naturally, they were meant to be impressed by the 7,000 cook shops, 1,000 baths, and service Saladin's army. There were, of course, none of the wine shops and brothels that serviced the Christian camps.
Okay, so one thing since we're talking now about Saladin, let's describe. He was a Kurd. The Kurds were from northwest Iran. He was Sunni by religion, and he had gained his fame in the armies of Mosul and Syria by entering into the service of the caliphs, the Shia caliphs of Egypt, and overthrowing the Abyssinian dynasty, and brings Shia rule to an end in Egypt. And so among Shia Muslims, Saladin has a really bad name. And what distinguishes Shia Muslims from Sunni Muslims in these affairs are, as Sunnis believe they can go to war with other Muslims, but Shias believe that that's forbidden. You can only go to war with Christians. And so Saladin went around creating his own big empire, and that is looked bad upon by the Shia, who consider that to be avaricious, warmongering, and against the Quran. But Saladin, and he was highly educated, and we're going to see, though he was Sunni, he acted more kind of like Shia in his toleration of Christians. We'll see how this works out in the negotiations with King Richard. And King Richard, for some reason, must have had counselors who really knew what was going on in the Mideast, and that they could make diplomatic overtures to Saladin and achieve something that way. So we often we are told that in the Middle Ages everyone was completely ignorant, but that's not right at all. Catholics were highly informed and were making very judicious decisions in many cases, and had experts all around them in every affair.
Yeah.
So the Christians win the Battle of Acre, is that not right?
Yeah.
And they take the city, and that's a blow to Saladin. Remember, Saladin has promised to keep the Crusaders out of the Holy Land and never let them take Jerusalem again. He's made that promise to the whole Islamic world, because in the Islamic world, Jerusalem's considered like the third holiest city. And so even though Muhammad never visited it in person. So what was the importance of taking the next two cities on the coast, Jaffa and Ascalon?
Yeah. On August 22nd, Richard pitched his tents outside the trenches of Acre, leaving his wife and his sister behind in the city. For 3 days he waited for the whole army to assemble. Elderly laundresses who washed clothes and heads were as clever as monkeys when it came to getting rid of lice, were the only camp followers whom Richard will allow to accompany the army on its march. This added to the reluctance of some of the soldiers to leave a city that had become, in Ambrosie's eyes, a shameful den of sin and lust. On August 25th, the march to Jaffa began. Richard's strategy was clear. First, conquer the coast as far as Ascalon. The great harbor fortress of Ascalon was the key to the vital road which linked Egypt and Syria, and as such, a key to Jerusalem. If both Egypt and Syria were in hostile hands and supplies could flow freely between them, there could be no hope of retaining Jerusalem. But if Ascalon were held by an aggressive soldier who posed a constant threat to the supply line, then though difficult, it might just be possible to hold Jerusalem. Presumably this was why, as early as 28th of July, Jeff, Geoffrey of Lusignan, had been granted the county of Jaffa and Ashkelon, not just because he was Guy of Lusignan, brother, but because he was one of the fighting heroes of the siege of Acre.
Mm-hmm. So he had a really good overall strategy of how to take back Jerusalem. Um, can you tell us more about how he took Haifa, or how is it that he ends up? I should say his strategy is to get to Jerusalem, and he knows Saladin has a superior force, and so he doesn't want his men to get involved in a battle. We see he's really good on discipline. He doesn't let any camp followers come along, and those are the prostitutes. But what is the role the heavy cavalry play, the knights, and in the next military engagements we see?
Yeah. The chief tactical weapon of the Franks was the charge of the heavy armored knights. Holding reins and shields in his left hand, the knight held a lance rigid beneath his right arm, using the horse's forward momentum to give power to the blow delivered by the lance. The weight of the charge was such that no other cavalry could stand up to it. It had been said that a Frank on horseback could make a hole through the walls of Babylon. After the initial impact, they were likely to fight with sword and mace rather than lance, driving home the advantage won by the charge. Generally speaking, if they succeeded in delivering a charge against the main body of their more lightly armed enemy, they won the battle. It was as simple as that, or as difficult. If the timing of the charge was fractionally wrong, the elusive Turkish cavalry was able to scatter, leaving the Franks beating against thin air. And once the charge had been delivered, the Franks, having lost their tight formation, became vulnerable to counterattack. The Turkish horse archers swarmed all around their enemy like goats round a man's head. To try to drive them away with the charge was all too often like using one's hand to beat off the gnats. The only observable result was a temporary agitation in the swarm.
Mm-hmm. So he marches down the coast. He keeps his men in tight order. He puts his knights, or heavy French cavalry, the Templars and the Hospitallers, on his inland flank, and he tells everyone, "Don't fight," because he knows that if Saladin can draw his heavy cavalry to break ranks, they'll be
Mm-hmm.
defeated because they have a numerically inferior thing. So they march. I think it's 3 days,
Yeah.
and I think it's the Templars. They just can't suffer anymore. They see these Muslims blaspheming at them day after day, and
Mm-hmm.
they want to go wet their swords in the blood of these infidels. And as I mentioned in our previous show, this is when some tactician, he had ordered the men not to just knights attack and get killed. Uh-huh. But as seeing them break ranks and begin a charge, the head of the Templars, the Grand Master, ordered his whole force in because he wasn't going to let some of his men die and get surrounded. And at that point, Richard could have done two things. He could have let a third of his force get totally destroyed and therefore lose the campaign, or he could change his rule, and he changes his rule and orders his entire army to attack, which greatly surprises Saladin's forces and overwhelms him and defeats him. And this is one of the great victories of the Third Crusade. And they follow up with several other attacks where they're not as successful. Saladin learned the trick, and
Mm-hmm.
so they fight some heavily battles with some heavy losses there. But is this why Jerusalem wasn't taken militarily?
Yeah. Just with the heavy felt vests that they wore underneath the armor, the heat got too much for them, and So they decided, let's win it another way. That great peace treaty that's still kept.
Mm-hmm. Now, does this have anything to do with Richard's being arrested and who was behind him being betrayed to the enemy?
Uh-huh. Okay. Let's see here. Oh yeah. On 28th December 1192, the Emperor Henry VI wrote to King Philip of France, "Because of our imperial majesty has no doubt that your royal highness will take pleasure in all those providences of God which exalt us in our empire, we have thought it proper to inform you of what happened to Richard, King of England," and he doesn't capitalize the K in King, "the enemy of our empire and the disturber of your kingdom. As he was crossing the sea on his way back to his dominions, his ship was driven by winds onto the Istrian coast. There it was wrecked at a place between Aquila and Venice. By God's will he and a few others escaped. A loyal subject of ours, Count Menard of Gors, and the people of the district, hearing that Richard was in their territory, and calling to mind the treason, treachery, and mischief of which he had been guilty in the Holy Land, went to arrest him. They captured 8 knights from his retinue, but he escaped. He reached a town called Friesack in the Archbishopric of Salzburg, where Frederick of Poitou arrested 6 more of his knights. Richard himself escaped yet again. This time was just 3 companions rode hard in the direction of Austria, but the roads were watched and guarded, and our dearly beloved cousin, Leopold, Duke of Austria, captured the king in a disreputable house near Vienna. He is now in our power. We know that this news will bring you great happiness.
So this tells us how bitter the rivalries were in the Third Crusade, because as it said, according to the hierarchical concepts of the hierarchy of kingdoms in the Middle Ages, the representative of the German king as emperor would have the first dignity. And at the Battle of Acre, the troops decided to give Richard the lead of the army, and thus insulted the pride of the King of France and the King of Germany, whose ambassador, I think, of Austria, the Duke of Austria, was present. And this is part of the reason why Richard is taken prisoner by Saladin and then released, and they make their treaty that allows the Christians to worship in Jerusalem, but Richard could not enter Jerusalem himself. And this is the treaty that has allowed Christians to worship in Jerusalem ever since 1199. But the Germans don't give up, and they imprison Richard on the way back. And this sets up the whole story we hear in the Robin Hood tales of King Richard being away, and they have to raise money to ransom him, to set in that context.
Yeah, but the Pope Celestine III was kind of a defender of King Richard. At Rome, Pope Celestine III absolved him and all who returned with him after him from their oaths as Jerusalem pilgrims. But according to Howden, Philip hoped for more from the Pope than this concession. An attempt to conceal the manifest wickedness of his nature, and setting aside the oath which he had sworn to Richard before leaving the land of Jerusalem, he complained about Richard to the Pope and all the cardinals, saying much about him that was unfitting, that it was he who driven him from the land of Jerusalem, that he never wanted to do anything for him, and he sought the Pope's permission to invade Richard's dominions. But the Pope forbade him to do any such thing, knowing that he was motivated only by envy, and told him he would be excommunicated if he touched him or his lands.
A great Pope there, Celestine III. I'll point out that, remember now, when you take the vow of the cross, your duty was to liberate Jerusalem. And since Richard and many of his men were not allowed to enter Jerusalem after the peace treaty, they couldn't fulfill the substance of their Crusader vow, and that's why he needed to be relieved of it by the Pope through it's called absolution of the vow, without which you would be guilty, you would be under the pain of excommunication. So you see how devious the King of France was. Richard had achieved such a great thing for Christians for the next 700 years that all the forces of darkness come out after him. And Philip disgraced himself by doing that, and so did the Duke of Austria and the German Emperor. And now, while Richard was held prison by the Duke of Austria, I hear he wrote a song or something.
Yeah. You can listen to it on YouTube. Okay, where is this at? Here. Yeah. It was probably soon after this that Richard composed his best known song, Yad Nos Ons Priest, while the desolation of some of those barons who had been on a crusade with him was still fresh in his mind. Feeble the words and faltering the tongue, wherewith a prisoner moans his doleful plight, yet for his comfort he may make a song. Friends have I many, but their gifts are slight. Shame to them if unransomed, I, poor wit, 2 winters languish here. English and Norman men of Aquitaine, well know they are all who homage owe to me, that not my lawless comrade in campaign should pine thus, had I gold to set him free. To none of them would I reproach be, yet I am prisoner here. This I have learned, here thus unransomed left, that he whom death or prison hides from sight of kinsmen and friends is clean bereft. Woe's me, but greater woe on these will light, yea, sad and full of shame will be their plight, if long I languish here. No marvel is it that my heart is sore, while my Lord tramples down my land. I trow were he but mindful of the oath we swore, each to the other, surely do I know, that thus in duress I should long ago have ceased to languish here. My comrades whom I loved, and still do love, the lords of Perch, and of Caillou. Strange tales have reached me that are hard to prove. I near was false to them for evermore. Vile would men account them, if their arms they bore against me, a prisoner here. And they, my knights of Anjou and Touraine, well know they who now sit at home at ease, that I their lord and far off Allemagne am captive. They should help me to my release, but now their swords are sheathed and rust in peace, while I am prisoner here.
Mm-hmm. And songs in the Middle Ages were a way of sending out help calls, kind of like we would say an appeal for fundraising, we might say. And so he was in prison for more than 2 years in Austria, and the ransom had to be paid from his realms. And this is really unique in the history of crusades. He's the only king who went on a crusade afterward was imprisoned by someone who was on crusade. And the Duke of Austria broke his Crusader vow to do this. And I think it was excommunicated by the Pope for it. But Austria was far from Rome, and the Pope had really no power to liberate him. And it's one of the things that adds to the drama of the life of Richard the Lionheart, that he had to suffer such a humiliation after such a victory. Maybe our Lord permitted it to humble him and save his soul. So we can't avoid talking about Robin Hood, Prince John, and the stories of Robin Hood. What's the real truth, and how does it differ from everything we see in the films?
Well, Robin Hood was a real guy, but it was way different than the stories. As he told me, he wasn't really like rob from the rich and give to the poor. And of course, with all this new internet censorship going on of conservatives and Christians, I could no longer find the actual document about the real Baron Robin of Luxley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do know he was a loyal supporter of King Richard, and he helped raise funds to ransom him. There's also a lot said about Prince John, who was actually the brother of Richard the Lionheart, and after Richard the Lionheart dies, becomes King of England.
Mm-hmm.
They make him look into like absolutely evil man that was involved in witchcraft and didn't raise money to release his brother, all of which is untrue, isn't it?
Yeah. And yeah. Let's see. Let's go to John. Yes. Here we go. John. Yeah. So John began to assert that his brother was dead or otherwise permanently lost. Richard had in fact been captured en route to England by the Duke of Austria. So John seized the opportunity and went to Paris, where he formed a military position. Where John went to Paris, formed an alliance with Philip. He agreed to set aside his wife, Isabella of Gloucester, and marry Philip's sister, Ilias, in exchange for Philip's support. Fighting broke out in England between the forces loyal to Richard and those being gathered by John. John's military position was weak and he agreed to a truce. In early 1194, the king finally returned to England and John's remaining forces surrendered, and John retreated to Normandy, where Richard finally found him later that year.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So that was Prince John, and Prince John goes on to inherit the throne of England after the death of Richard the Lionheart, and he's the one that's defeated in the baronial law and grants the Magna Carta just some years later in 1215, just so you say how the famous thing. So how was Richard actually freed? Was he ransomed or did he escape the Duke of Austria's prison?
hmm, okay. He was released. It was evident that John's gamble had failed miserably. His castles in England were besieged and were certain to fall. It was said that the castle of St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall died of fright when he heard the news that Richard had landed. In Normandy, Philip had granted him custody of Arques, Drincourt, and Evreux, but even if he managed to hold them against his brother, they could in no way compensate for the loss of the estates which Richard had given him in 1189. Even before Richard reached England, the Council of Rome had declared John's estates forfeit, and the bishops had excommunicated him. The best he could do was to throw himself on the brother's mercy. He had achieved nothing except to cause some damage to the empire which he still had a chance of inheriting, and to give the world further evidence of his ineptitude and treachery. And also Leopold of Austria for daring to imprison a crusader. He was excommunicated in order to pay back the ransom money. He refused. He had spent a great deal, probably 26,000 marks, expected another 20,000 when Eleanor of Brittany arrived to marry his son. But 7 months passed from the day of Richard's release, and there was still no sign of the promised bride. He threatened to execute his hostages unless Richard sent his niece to Austria. And one of the hostages, Baldwin of Bethune, was given the task of carrying the news to the king. The threat worked. In December 1194, Baldwin of Bethune set off again for Austria, escorting both Eleanor and the daughter of Isaac Canute. But on 26 December, while Leopold was out riding, his horse fell and crushed his foot. By the next day, the foot had gone black. The surgeons advised amputation, but Leopold could find no one who had either the strength of mind or heart to perform the painful operation. Despite the Duke's pleading, not even his son or an heir could steel himself to the task. Eventually, Leopold himself had to hold an axe close to the bone of his leg and order the servant to drive the axe through with a mallet. After 3 blows, the gangrene foot was removed, but it was too late. On the last day of the year, Leopold died after having made his peace with the church and promised to make full restitution to Richard. The hostages returned home. In the eyes of the Angevins, God's justice had been done, but in the eyes of one early 13th century German commentator, it was a sin committed in imprisoning Richard, which explained why the Holy Land had not yet been liberated.
Okay, and it will point out the further justice of God is that Leopold's house, I'll pause a moment here, we're getting unstable connection. The house of Leopold dies out within 120 years, and Austria is inherited by the Habsburgs, and that's how the Habsburgs come to Austria. And less than 120 years, I think 80 years. Whereas the house of King Richard, the Plantagenets, survive in England until the 16th century, just at the beginning of the 16th century. So our Lord, even from eternity, rewarded their heirs, those with merits for merit, and those who were heirs of a villain with punishment. So let's now talk something about the character of Richard the Lionheart. What kind of a man was he? What was his personality like? What kind of estimation can you draw, AJ?
The two Cistercians who visited Richard saw in him a man whose ability to rise above the vicissitudes of fortune won the admiration of all. It may have been from information supplied by them that Abbot Ralph of Coggeshall formed his judgment on the king in prison. No tribulation could cloud the countenance of this most serene prince. His words remained cheerful and jocund, his actions fierce or most courageous as time, place, reason, or person demanded. In captivity as well on the crusade, Richard became a figure of romance. The legends that clustered about his imprisonment are legends which relate to his private personality and his musicality. And according to the earliest known version of Blondel legend, Blondel was the minstrel who discovered the whereabouts of Richard's prison in a lofty castle. He was resting in a garden at the foot of the tower in which Richard was held when the king saw him sing. For he sang very well, the first part of a song which they had composed and which was known only to two of them. Two songs attributed to Richard in early troubadour manuscripts. Rotrogun, Old French. Rotrogrungi, said to have been composed in captivity in Cervantes, aimed at Dauphine of Avignon. It is impossible to be absolutely certain that Richard did write them, but evidence that he was unusually interested in music is overwhelming. Although nothing is known of Richard's education, two things are clear. First, that the education of a young noble would have included music. Second, that Richard was very well educated and is worth remembering the place of southwest France in the history of music. In the Anglo-Norman Romance of Horn, composed in 1170, which Richard would almost certainly have known, the author, Master Thomas, presents the hero, Horn, as a model of the accomplished prince. He is a master of the arts, hunting, hawking, of swordsmanship, horsemanship. Above all, there is no musical instrument known to mortal man which the princely Lord Horn did not surpass everyone. For he took a harp, anyone who watched how he touched the strings and made them vibrate, sometimes causing them to sing, and at other times to join in harmonies, would have been reminded of the harmony of heaven. Richard was presumably not in this class, and there is no explicit evidence for him playing an instrument. However, that he did write songs like those attributed to him, songs with its political content, is shown by Ambrosie's report of Richard Reposette and kind to a song written by the Duke of Burgundy. He has definitely enjoyed music of all kinds. The Cistercian Ralph of Cogswell observed the pleasure he took in church music. When the clerks of his royal chapel were singing in the choir, he would often walk among them, urging them with voice and hand to sing with greater gusto.
That's quite a king, let me tell you. So he was also impatient. I mean, you told me yesterday when he was at Messina, he went out riding with some noblemen and they ran upon a Sicilian peasant, who knows, one of my ancestors, carrying some canes in from the field, and they decided to joust, and then they got in an argument, and one of the guys wouldn't get off his horse. He clung to the neck of his horse like a coward, and Richard got so upset that he ordered him never to be in his presence again. So
Mm-hmm.
he was given to some impatience and some impetuosity. Um, Tell us now something about the end of his life. When, on what day did he die, and how did it happen?
Okay, I'm going to read this a little bit from Geoffrey of Vinsois. O death, do you realize whom you snatched from us? To our eyes he was light, to our ears melody, to our minds in amazement you realize impious death, whom you snatched from us. He was the Lord of warriors, the glory of kings, the light of the world. Nature knew not how to add any further perfection. He was the utmost she could achieve, but that was the reason you snatched him away. If heavens allow it, I chide even God. God, why do you fail? If you recall, he alone defended your Jaffa against many thousands. Acre too he restored to you. The enemies of the cross bear witness, all of them Richard in life, inspired with such care that he is still feared now he is dead. O Lord, if it is permissible to say it, let me say with your leave, you could have done with the more graciously and less haste. If you had bridled the foe at least, and there would have been little delay. He was on the verge of success. He could he could then have departed more worthily to remain with you. But by this lesson you have made us known how brief is the laughter of earth, and how long are its tears.
That's a very eloquent eulogy. And so how is it that he died, and when did he die, and what did he die of?
To, to After supper on the evening of 26 March 1199, all daylight was beginning to fade. Richard left his tent in order to observe the progress of the siege, and to exercise, as he often did, his own skill with a crossbow. Because he was not riding into battle, he wore no armor except an iron headpiece, relying for protection on the rectangular shield which was carried before him. That day, only one member of the garrison, a crossbow using a frying pan to shield, was brave enough to show himself on the ramparts. It was a splendidly makeshift gesture of defiance, but to the professional soldiers under Richard's command, his occasional shots could be nothing more than a minor irritant. The lone figure of the crossbowman was the frying pan was still visible on the parapets of the doomed castle, and Richard could not help applauding as the man sent a well-aimed bolt in his direction. As a result, he was fractionally late in ducking behind the shield, and was struck on his left shoulder. Not wishing either to alarm his own men or to give heart to the defenders, he made no sound. Calmly he returned to his tent as though nothing had happened. Once inside, he tried to pull the bolt, but succeeded only in breaking off the wooden shaft, leaving the iron bar the length of the arm's hand. Deeply embedded into the flesh, the surgeons arrived, working by the flickering light of the torches. He managed to remove the bolt, but the shoulder was badly hacked about. The wound from the bolt and the surgeon's knife were treated and bandaged up. The king's wound turned gangrenous, and daily the infection spread. Richard had been seen too many men die, not knowing what was happening to him. He wrote to his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she came in haste. To keep the news from getting out, Richard stayed in his tent, allowing only 4 of the most trusted associates. Soon afterwards, Charles Chabot fell, but it was no longer a victory. Richard forgave the man who had shot him, then confessed his sins and received extreme unction. At Chalus on 6th April, as evening came, he died. According to Roger of Howden, the king's body was then disposed of according to the instructions. His brain and entrails were buried on the Poitiers-Limousin border at Chalus, an abbey which claimed none other than Charlemagne as its founder. His heart went to Rouen, where he was buried next to his elder brother. According to Gervase of Canterbury, it was an unusually large heart, a little bigger than a pomegranate, said others. The rest of him, together with the crown and regula he had worn at Winchester, reported the Winchester annalist, was buried at Fontevraud at his father's feet on Palm Sunday, 11th of April. The effigy of his tomb, shaped like a draped gear, shows him crowned, scepter, majestically attired, his sword by his side. As his body went north, so too did the stories which attempted to make sense of so unexpected an event. At their focal point of the discovery of this treasure, in Richard's attempt to seize it for himself, as it plain from his own account of Richard's motives in going to the limousine. The well-informed Coxhill had heard a story of buried treasure, though he had also taken the trouble to identify it as a story. There are some people who say, separate from his report of the campaign against Philip's limousine allies, it may be that there was no treasure. Certainly no treasure appears in account of Richard's death, but the author was much better placed to know the background to the story than anyone else. This is Bernard Etier. In 1199, Bernard was in his mid-30s, a monk in a Benedictine abbey of Saint Michel in Limoges, where he later became librarian. Relations between the Viscounts of Limoges and Saint Martials, though often tense, were also extremely close. The Viscount's castle stood cheek by jowl with the abbey, and the abbey was traditional burial place of the Viscounts. Much of Bernard's historical writing took the form of brief marginal notes or the memoranda jotted down here and there among manuscripts in the library of Saint Martial. Very often, these notes began with phrases such as, "Written Bernard, it's here." His account of Richard's death was written in a note of this kind added to the library's copy of the Chronicle of Geoffrey de Vigeot.
So even mighty kings can fall by the errant bull. The problem in the Middle Ages of dying of arrow shots was that you're wearing clothing that has all kinds of dirt and grime and infection on it. And as the bolt enters, or the arrow enters your flesh, it takes a small amount of that cloth of your external garments into the wound, and that which causes the abscess, the blood infection, and the subsequent death. Unless they get out every last bit of thread, it's very dangerous, and they didn't have pure alcohol to cleanse the wound. So he dies right before Holy Week,
And this
and goes to his judgment.
and this was also from the Cistercian monk. However, the Cistercian monk did not leave it there. He went on to write that Richard gave a fine example to all other rulers by quickly filling ecclesiastical vacancies rather than, as previous rulers had done, prolonging vacancies in order to fill his own coffers. He drew attention to Richard's enthusiasm for church music and to his respectable behavior during Mass. Finally, he turned to Richard's devotion to Saint Edmund, to his generous benefactions to the Church, above all to the Cistercian order. This enabled him to conclude with hope that Richard's pious deeds, together with his final confession and contrition, would be enough to ensure his salvation.
Okay, very noble record that monk made a point to tell us, because not all Catholic kings in the Middle Ages were interested or as zealous as they should be with the liberty of the church, and that is to his honor, considering all the things he suffered. So, wow, we learned a lot about King Richard of Lionheart in this program, and this was very informative. I thank you for asking me to host this program, AJ, and talk about this distant uncle of yours and the great things he achieved, and set the record straight about him. Okay. Yeah. I think one thing we should point out is that Catholics really need to make dramatic movies of Catholic history, because that's the only way the truth is going out on how great Catholics were and the greatness of their character, which is so beyond the absolute pathetic examples of Freemasons in modern times, and how much more wonderful and common sense Catholic government was with all this nonsense of political theater. So.
Yeah. And as I said, I would do, before we went live, about what we were talking about with the Orleans and Louis of Bourbon, how their families renounced the titles to the thrones of France and Spain. I have not done that. I will not do that.
Okay. So AJ, if you don't know, AJ is a cognatic descendant of the kings of France. So if you like this program and you appreciate these programs that we're doing on Ordo Militaris Radio TV, please make sure to make a free will offering subscription or a recurring free will offering subscription to Ordo Militaris Radio TV to help us buy equipment. It doesn't go to my salary or AJ's salary, it goes to equipment and our expenses to maintain the website. And that will be greatly appreciated, because we do these programs for your sake and for your edification.
And we already had to get more equipment, new speakers for the new computer system. So please keep donating to help us update whatever else we need. So make a donation, go to ordo-militaris.net. any of the show pages except our first show on the appeal to Lebanon has that donation button for the radio apostolate. So please be generous there. And also, there are merchandise that you can get on our Teespring store. I want to thank our listener here out of Australia who bought some stuff. So if you see our radio cross in Australia, you'll know why. So you can get a mug. The mug I show once in a while on the show. You can get the T-shirt of Watermill Terrace Radio. You can get the die-cal sticker, which goes on your car or boat or locker or whatever. And you can also, when it gets cold enough, you can get the hoodie and the Lepanto sweatshirts. You can also get the Lepanto T-shirt and the Lepanto mug as well. Anything
Okay.
else?
No, that'd be all. I thank you for having me on Automilitas Radio TV. AJ, it's always an honor, and thank you.
Yep. This is Automil Terrace Radio TV signing off. Des Full.
Deus Volt.